Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is expanding to include. We, as we try to or move toward awakening, we often talk about letting go. And today, instead, we're going to talk about expanding to include, which ultimately creates the same result, but has sort of a different ethos about it. So good morning, Rosalind. Welcome. Happy new week and Monday to you and to everybody else who's joining us. Before we get started with our conversation for today, let's take a couple minutes to get present. So let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells and your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, all your molecules, all your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together and vigorously rub your hands together to feel all those sensations, the friction, the pressure, the temperature, the motion, and the tickling and tingling when you stop, and allow all of those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables you to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So good to be back with you for the beginning of another week. And as we start the week, why not start it in a notion of expansiveness? And so I know I've talked with you about this before, but it seemed like a good time to bring it back. And as a Western culture, we are acclimated toward acquisition. We're conditioned to it over and over and over again. And so why not use that to further our spiritual objectives rather than to have to struggle against it, in addition to all the other challenges of awakening. So the notion here is, instead of letting go, what if we expand to include? Because letting go, we're holding on, right? And to be able to let go, we have to relinquish, release, and if what I notice is that along with that idea of letting go, what often plays a part is that there's judgment that is attached to whatever it is we're trying to let go of. And so this notion of expanding to include allows us to move into a place of acceptance and inclusivity rather than exiling parts of ourselves. So for instance, our darkness, our greed or anger, resentment, to expand to include that, and to recognize, yeah, there's that there. It's there. It's part of my experience. It's part of my experience of being who I am. And as I expand to include that, of necessity, I can recognize that it's not who I am, that it's not the entirety of who I am, that it's a part of who I am or how I show up in the world. And the truth is, at least in my awareness, I'll call it a hypothesis rather than the truth for now. But the truth that I'm experimenting with, that I'll call a hypothesis, is that we have the capacity to be all things, that we can be brilliantly bright light, and we can be very immersive darkness. And given circumstances that trigger us in certain ways and directions, that we're capable of all things. And to expand, to include our shadow, allows us to begin to heal it, to begin to integrate it, to be able to become more whole as we have this expansion, to recognize that we are truly unbounded, that we are not black and white. We are all the colors. We are the entire spectrum. And the notion of expanding to include gives us permission to recognize all these parts of ourselves without having to exile them, without reviling them, hopefully without hating them, to be able to face the shame or the disappointment, the judgment, to be able to recognize that and include that, then it doesn't invalidate those experiences, and it also doesn't invalidate the experiences that are not that. So what happens often is that we get angry, and we then demand of ourselves or call ourselves, let it go, let it go, let it go. And yet there's the anger, and there's maybe the hurt that inspired the anger, and there's all this other complex. And rather than that's sort of a rejection of the experience of that anger, right? When we say just let it go, it's not being present to the dynamics behind that experience that can be very important and empowering to recognize. We could then get to be able to heal it if we can allow ourselves to be present to it. But if we're busy trying to let it go before we ever what the intention here is to create a wholeness. And as we expand to include, then there's a greater and greater opening. And what we recognize is that we are all of it and we are none of it, all at the same time, by by broadening our perspective and our awareness of our being. There's a tremendous fluidity of being that is at our essence. And where that fluidity comes from is, again, another one of my hypotheses. And I say hypotheses because I don't know that can, we have operating principles, right? But whether my operating principles are in fact more true or real than yours, that's not the case, right? You have the principles and perspectives through which you're creating the world in which you exist. And so the hypothesis that I'm talking about is truth with a lowercase t rather than truth with an uppercase T. So that said, when I can allow for all aspects of myself, then I become life expressing itself through me. So that's what, in terms of identity, that's the hypothetical identity that I'm operating with. It's the most true definition or self-definition that I have yet entertained, is that who I am is life living itself through this unique vessel that I am. And so life then expresses itself in a myriad of ways that are a changing flow, that is an ongoing river of expression, of energy, of thought, belief, experience. And it's mutable. Its banks can change. It's got its own ebbs and flows as this life flows through it. So it has myriad expressions. And if we allow for that kind of fluidity in our definitions of ourselves, in expanding to include, then we can open ourselves to a greater spectrum of potential and experience. And there's a self-acceptance that comes from that it's an interesting thing, because it's a self-acceptance and it's also selfless, right? By being all things, we are no thing in particular, right? And that gives us a wholeness. And yet, in that notion of self, there is a fear that some people, probably most people, encounter of annihilation. Like, if I'm not this fixed thing, if I'm not this fixed identity, I don't know who I am. And what if who I am is evolving? What if who I am is emergence? And then I have the freedom to experience and explore all kinds of things that might not fit with these limiting ideas that I have about myself. And so I wonder, as you entertain this notion of fluidity, unboundedness, being all of it, it gives us space, doesn't it? I mean, doesn't it? Obviously, we're talking about unboundedness. It does give us space and permission to be, where of course, we are expressions on the entire spectrum of experience. I had a wonderful conversation with a shaman the other day, someone who does ceremony, transformational ceremony with people. That's what they do for their living, and they've studied with all kinds of shamans around the world. And they were saying, you know, sometimes I'm the obnoxious guy at the gas station, and other times I'm the guru. And I think that that is true for all of us. You know, that there are times when we're the guru, there are times when we're the obnoxious one. There are times when we're awakened and times when we're deep in our stuff. And that's part of that river of being, that flow of life, that expression of change and diversity. There are moments when we're not elevated as we may be. There are moments when we're not, right? And to give ourselves permission to recognize that that's part of life. You know, if we look at nature, nature has sunny days and tremendous storms. Nature can be tremendously generative and powerfully destructive. And we are an extension, we are part of nature. You know, we can see animals in the wild being very loving and also murderous, right? As hunters or carnivores that hunt for their food. So this idea of expanding to include just allows me anyway to take a breath, to have a sigh of relief, to relax into life a bit more fully, and accepting, self-accepting, allowing myself to forgive or metabolize the different expressions and to own them. When we own, let's say we act in a way that we don't particularly approve of, or that doesn't feel good. If we have this notion of life and our expression within life as being all of it, then we have the ability to accept and acknowledge that behavior. We don't have to turn away from it. We can recognize it, and then we can deal with the fallout. We can make apologies if apologies are called for. You know, we can learn from our I'm going to call them transgressions, perceived transgressions, right? So we can recognize, oh, we express something in a way that we would prefer not to have, for instance. We can come back and own that and be accountable for it and be responsible for it, rather than being stuck in the shame and regret, for instance. We may regret something, but we can at least move into it, move toward it, lean in. So Rosalind says, discerning between our nature versus culture. That's an interesting conversation right there. If my nature is just being, maybe I can do that for at least 10 minutes. The practice is bringing forth this being into culture. If my nature is just being, maybe I can do that for at least 10 minutes. 10 minutes might be a lot for a lot of people to even be able to do that, Rosalind. So good on you. The practice is bringing forth this being into culture. Yeah, that's the challenge. You know, when I think that the notion of expanding to include allows us to be able to better, more gracefully navigate the experience of culture and its many, many faces, and to recognize that we are a many-faced expression of that culture and our beingness too, because part of our beingness in it, and this is going to sound ironic, I guess, but part of our beingness is our separation from our beingness, you know, getting so caught in doing that we're not present. And that is part of how we be in the world, is disconnected, disassociated, not present, right? I mean, that is a state of being as well, rather than presence. And it's all of it. We're all of it. And I think that the willingness to accept that we're all of it, you know, like we want to create these labels, we want to create black and white things or distinctions that aren't really necessarily accurate. You know, I can say I'm a good person, but it doesn't mean that I always behave in alignment with that idea, right? Maybe that's my guiding light, maybe that's my intention, and I can use that North Star to self-correct when I don't behave in alignment with what I believe that good person expression in the world is, you know. But maybe instead of I'm a good person is I'm human, you know, like what makes a good person? I guess that when we can, I know it's really tempting to categorize and sort into these black and white sorts of categories. You know, I'm a good person, they're a bad person. You know, I'm right, they're wrong. It's their fault, I'm not to blame. You know, all of these kinds of things, rather than there's this intricately interwoven dynamic of singular being, but that singular being doesn't exist within a vacuum. It exists within a greater context, a greater ecology. And depending upon what's going on, you know, if I'm a good so this idea of a good person, if I'm a good person, then I behave in certain ways, right? And what if I don't behave that way? Does it make me no longer a good person? And rather than be debating about whether I'm a good person or not a good person, maybe we get to look at that label of good person to begin with, and how it's a maybe it's a very skewed like maybe the foundational idea is faulty, to be evaluating things based on that kind of metric. Like what is it that makes us determine that somebody's a good person or not a good person? And if we can expand to include our humanity, the whole foundation against which we make judgments shifts. So we spoke last week about judgment versus discernment. And I think that that's what this gets down to, is allowing ourselves to go beyond judgment into a deeper, richer understanding of being and our own being, and being an expression of life, and the many, many, many faces of that. And that the notion of good person, bad person is way, way, way oversimplified. And that there might be a whole new realm of experience available to us if we can move beyond that into the inclusiveness of a greater whole. So it gets kind of interesting to be thinking about it when we think in terms of values and judgments and perspectives and what's right and what's wrong. Very interesting conversation. So Rosalind says, starting point to do this for self, 100%, because as we accept ourselves, as we expand within ourselves, then it shifts our relationship with others. As we make peace with parts of ourselves that have their own quote unquote awfulness about them or darkness, as we expand and include those things, then we can have a greater compassion for others and their darkness too. Doesn't mean we have to engage with it, but we can have a greater compassion for it. So with that, thank you for being here for this conversation and your engagement, your love. And until next time, I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel at 9 a.m. Eastern. And I invite you to check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network and Enlightened World Living. And until next time.